Ever since Sydney's Marrickville Council passed and then rescinded a boycott on Israel, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has been the subject of heated debate. Is the boycott anti-Semitic because it targets Jews as individuals, or is it a legitimate protest against Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territories? James Carleton explores these two issues.
Only the Green senators voted not to condemn the boycott. They say not because they support it, but because they don't want to brand those who do as Nazis. So when do critics of Israel cross the line into hating Jews? Also important, when do supporters of Israel wrongly accuse critics of anti-Semitism? Certainly the temperature of the debate is boiling hot. The Labour Party's Paul Howes says the boycotters mimic Nazi thugs. The National Party's Ron Boswell says it's 1939 revisited. And Liberal Senator Eric Abetz says the BDS, the international campaign of boycotts, divestment and sanctions against Israel, has crossed the line.
It brings an ugly dimension to Australian domestic politics when people start demonstrating against businesses solely from Israel.
Why is it anti-Semitic, though?
Because it is quite clear that the campaign is only against those businesses that emanate from Israel.
What about a boycott, say, only against Japan over the issue of whaling? It'd be radical, arguably extreme, but inherently racist against Japanese? But in Israel and the Palestinian territories, the present is defined by the past, unlike anywhere else on earth. And the defining element of modern Jewish history has nothing to do with the Palestinians. Senator Abetz.
The events that took place in Germany started off with targeting a few Jewish businesses, and then one thing led to another. When that starts setting in, the lesson of history teaches us what it will develop into.
Samar Sabawi from Australians for Palestine agrees the lessons from the Holocaust are important, but they're inapplicable to the boycott for a very simple reason.
There are no businesses being targeted in Australia for being Jewish. If that ever happens, we will be the first to speak out against it. Max Brenner, the reason that it is part of the list of businesses to boycott is because it is owned and run by the Strauss Group, and because the Strauss Group actively supports the Israeli occupation forces. The company Caterpillar, which is not Jewish and not Israeli, but it is on the boycott list because it provides the bulldozers that demolish tens of thousands of Palestinian homes and bringing up Nazi Germany, is just an insensitive, inaccurate diversion from what the facts are about.
Well then why, asks Senator Abetz, is it only Israel that's being targeted?
It's interesting that there was never a BDS movement against Colonel Gaddafi and Libya, and so to turn a blind eye to all the Arab countries and dictatorships, one wonders what motivates these people.
So what motivates Samar Sabawi?
Well, first of all, who else is Palestinian civil society supposed to single out? China? China is not occupying them. But more importantly, the question is why single out the Palestinians as the only people we're not allowed to speak up for? Why do we single the Palestinians out for our silence? You say, why Israel? But I'm asking, why not the Palestinians? The minute you start speaking on Palestinian rights, you get all the crazies out of the woodwork with their sledgehammers.
But if we're talking about Palestinian rights, Israel's a democracy, isn't it?
Arab citizens who live in Israel certainly have the right to vote, but are treated as second-class citizens simply because they're not Jewish. And then you've got the Palestinians who live under Israel's occupation in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip who don't have the right to vote. And then you've got the settlements where the Jewish settlers have the freedom to travel anywhere they want. The Palestinians are not allowed to travel on the same roads from village to village, let alone from leaving. That is not a democracy. You can't have a country that have two sets of rules, one for Jews and one for non-Jews. Democracies don't work that way.
But back to the question of anti-Semitism, does the boycott target Australian Jews? Senator Eric Abetz.
The BDS movement, via the Greens, has been asking for a sporting and cultural boycott of Australia-Israel relationships.
But not Australian Jews.
Well, one would assume that those ties would include Jewish people living in Australia. There are Australian Jews associated with the businesses. Australian Jews are highly offended.
Of course they are, but do you accept they're not being targeted because they're Australian Jews?
Well, I think it's very difficult in the circumstances to try to differentiate between the two.
But Samar Sabawi says Senator Abetsa's inability to differentiate between Israel and Australians who happen to be Jewish is itself an example of anti-Semitism.
To lump all the Jews in Australia into one category and make them responsible for Israel's actions is actually the epitome of anti-Semitism. And for Abetz not to see the distinction, I think that should be troubling. There is a distinction between being Jewish, there is a distinction between being Israeli and being Jewish, and there is a distinction between being an Israeli citizen and being actually responsible and supportive of the government of Israel's military.
But Senator Abetz says that ignores an important point.
The boycott does have racist elements in it, as witnessed by the defacing of the Israeli flag with a swastika and with a pig's head.
Anthony Lowenstein is co-founder of Independent Australian Jewish Voices. He's a Jew, but he supports boycotting Israel.
Well, I've never seen that at protests outside Max Brenner. I've been to many of them, and if there were, they obviously should be condemned. But I think the more important issue here, in both Sydney and Melbourne, the Australian Protectionist Party, which is a far-right group associated with neo-Nazis and Stormfront, marched alongside the pro-Israel supporters.
But isn't the far-right anti-Jew traditionally? Why would they be supporting Israel?
Traditionally, they do hate Jews, and I think their hatred of Jews hasn't changed, but their hatred and dislike of Muslims and Arabs is stronger.
But Dr. Danny Lamb, the president of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, says regardless of who's for or against, any boycott of Israel is odious, in particular the comparison to South Africa.
I know what apartheid is. I know about the separation between black and white. None of that exists in Israel.
What about the occupied territories?
What about the territories? The territories, Israel is in the state, in the area of Judea and Samaria until such time as there is a negotiated settlement. The reason there is no Palestinian state is fundamentally because they don't want it. Because if they wanted it, they'd establish the mechanisms that would create a possibility. And the ABC in particular has got to look to start recognising there are all sorts of rights and opportunities because Israel is there. There were no universities on the West Bank before Israel came.